Hey everybody, we're doing more on this Tetris game. Last time we added wall kicks, which is this feature where when you're up against the wall and you rotate, if the piece needs to be moved in order to allow that rotation to happen, it'll do it. So in continuing the theme of sort of improving the controls of our game, something I want to try to do is allow the player to do what's called a hard drop in Tetris. We already have a soft drop, where I'm pressing and holding the down arrow key in order to make the piece fall faster. But what we want to do is add a sort of instantaneous drop option, where you can press the spacebar and the piece will just fall all the way to the bottom instantaneously. So in order to do that, we're going to have to update our update falling piece custom block. This is sort of what handles the controls and the movement of the falling piece, and so this is a logical place to put our control code. Now we already have the right arrow, left arrow, and up arrow, and in order to do all of this, we're using our key hold frames list. And if you remember how this works, we've got all -1s because I'm not pressing any of the keys. But as soon as I press and hold the right arrow, item number 1 starts counting up, and when I let go, it goes back to -1. The same is true of list item 2. This is the left arrow now that I'm holding down, and I can track multiple keys at once if I'm pressing left and right both. List item number 3 is for the up arrow, and then if I press the space bar, that's where list item number 4 gets involved. And so in order to detect whether we've pressed the space bar, we need to check out list item number 4. So I'm going to get list item number 4 of the key hold frames list, and this will tell us how many frames we've held down the spacebar. Now we only want to run this command. We only want to do the hard drop right when you press the spacebar. If you hold the spacebar down, it shouldn't drop multiple pieces. That would be a way to end your game very quickly. So in order to check whether it's the very first frame that you've held down the spacebar, we're going to check whether the value is equal to 0. It'll be -1 if you're not holding it down, then it'll become 0 on that very first frame that you press it, and then after that it'll keep counting up and never fire again. So this is going to be sort of our if statement, this is going to be our condition, and I'm actually going to use an if-else here. And the reason I'm doing that is because all of this other code that does right arrow, left arrow, rotation, and sort of the automatic falling of the piece, none of this makes sense to do at the same time as you're pressing the spacebar. And so if you press the spacebar, we don't want to do any of this. So what I'm going to do is put this inside of an else to say only do this if you're not pressing space, if you're not doing a hard drop. So yeah, everything in our entire update falling piece, except for updating the timer, is going to go inside of this else. Now, one thing I've just noticed here is that when we were programming this spacebar detection, we didn't actually use the key pressed block. And it's sort of becoming apparent to me that we don't need that on any of these three sort of little if statements either. But if we're checking for the up arrow, we already are checking for it to be pressed just by checking the list item. We don't really need this at all. And so I think just to keep the code sort of clean and small, this is a good chance to sort of get rid of all of this unneeded code and say we don't have to check the actual key sort of directly in this code because we're already doing that and using it to update the list. So just checking the list should be enough. And if we test this out, yeah, all of our right and left and rotation, it all still works. And we got a little bit less code, which is always nice. All right, so inside of our if statement, we want to write some code for when we press the spacebar to do the hard drop. And essentially what we're doing is just saying, move the piece down one at a time over and over again until you hit the bottom, which is normally what would happen as the piece naturally falls. We're just going to do the entire process all at once. And so we can kind of look at our code here and see how it's done with the slow, once every 15 frames falling, and then just take that and do it really fast. Essentially what we're doing here is we're saying look down and see whether it's valid to move the piece down by 1, and if it is, then move it. That's essentially all. If it's not valid, then we know that you've hit the bottom, and it's time to save the piece to the grid. So we're going to do something similar up here, and I think what we're going to do is when you press space, we're going to start by moving the piece down by 1. So we'll change the piece Y by 1. That's going to go inside of here. Then we want to check whether or not the move that we just did was valid. So we're going to say check if piece is valid, and we're just going to get the actual current coordinates of the piece. So we'll move it down, and then we'll check if that move down is valid. And if it is not valid, that would be when we want to stop moving it down and lock it into place. Although we'll want to move it up 1 as well. So I think what we're going to do is put this inside of a repeat loop, where we say constantly move the piece down by 1 and check if it's valid until it no longer is valid. Keep moving it down until we've gone too far, until our move is no longer valid. But of course, if we go too far, if we move the piece all the way past the bottom, that's going to be problematic. And so what we want to do is just, when we go too far, go back up by 1. We'll say go too far, go until you're no longer valid, and then undo that last move, because that was too far, put it back into the lowest valid spot, and then we want to lock the piece into place. That's the last thing we're going to do. So we will say, how do we lock the piece into place? I guess we have to say store piece to grid, right? So we will get the piece X, the piece Y, the piece rotation, and the piece type. And we'll store sort of the tiles from the piece onto the actual grid. Then we want to clear any filled rows, just in case any rows have become completely full. We'll clear them, delete those rows, and then make a new piece. And these 3 blocks are sort of the same as what we do when we hit the bottom here. It's the exact same process as when we normally hit the bottom of the board, not using the spacebar. And then we've got this set piece fall timer to 0. We should probably do that when you press the spacebar as well. This one is probably not super important. It might be difficult for the player to even notice whether or not we do this, but when we press space, we want to make it so that it's a full 15 frames before the new piece falls again. All right, let's try it. So we've got a falling piece. I can press the right and left arrows and the up arrow, but when I press space, aha, it jumps all the way to the bottom. You can see we've got that instantaneous jump. I'll do it again, press space, boom, all the way to the bottom. That's really fun, and because of the way that we've sort of written our code, where everything is custom blocks, it was actually pretty easy to do. I feel like that was a nice short little process to create this feature. So that's a fun one. Hey everyone, future Pull Josh here. I finished recording the last video and then realized afterward that there's actually still a problem with our project here. We've got this spacebar, which is super handy. The problem is that it's actually possible to make your pieces stick onto the wall. You can see I can just stick them on the side like this, which is definitely not what we want. The way that I do this is by holding the right or the left arrow keys at the same time as I press the spacebar. And it took me a little bit of time to figure out exactly why this is happening. But if you look in our script here, when we press the spacebar, we have this repeat until loop that repeats until our piece is no longer valid, until this is valid variable is false. And that is valid variable gets updated every time we run check if piece is valid. Now the problem is that when we're pressing the right or the left arrow key, and you press it while you're up against a wall, for instance, if I press the right arrow key here, it'll check if moving the piece 1 space to the right is valid. And if you're right up against the wall, the answer is no. Is valid is going to be false. And the problem is that this is valid variable never gets reset. When you run this, it becomes false as you're pressing the right arrow key when you're up against the right, or the left when you're against the left. This is valid becomes false, and then when we go to run this repeat loop, it never actually runs, because it's false right from the start, and so it doesn't have to run at all. So in order to prevent this, we just want to reset the isValid variable before we run our loop. So we'll just set isValid to true before we run the loop. And now if I hold the right arrow key and press space, you can see it drops all the way down. So that was a quick little issue. I probably should have tested a little bit better while recording the video initially, but I'm glad that I caught it now so that we can get this problem solved. Although it was a little bit fun when you could stick them to the walls.